There are quite a few things to enjoy about the fifth episode of the Rings of Power Season 2. The seven rings are given to the dwarves, the faithful and the kinsmen really clash for the first time, and Annatar slash Sauron begins his manipulation of Celebrimbor. This part of the Numenorian storyline picks up the pace for what leads to the fall of Numenor, and Sauron's evil devices make themselves prevalent in creating the rings. As usual, there are lore accuracies and inaccuracies and some cheesy moments. I'll be joined by Jared Stonefield, who is a lifelong Tolkien fan, and he'll contribute with his deep knowledge of the Middle-earth lore. With that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I have with me Jared Stonefield, my guest, and we're going to be talking about the Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 5. Just to start us out, Jared, what got you interested in Lord of the Rings? For instance, did you watch the trilogy first and then read the books, or read the books and watch the trilogy, that kind of a thing? Yeah.
So I actually don't remember the first time ever being exposed to Tolkien. That's how long it's been in my life. I know at some point I watched the trilogy for the first time, but I just don't remember. We grew up watching those so often in my family household that I think I have those memorized to an insane amount at this point. And then after the movies, I got right into the Silmarillion. I got, into The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. And they're some of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's definitely something I've gotten into since after watching the movies. Similarly, I was very young whenever they came out, but that's kind of where it started, and we'd always watch them growing up, all the time, memorize lines and requoting, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely that's definitely where we started, and then I just got into the books after that. Yeah, so for this episode, I believe we got 3 different storylines that we're going with. So we got the dwarves, we have elves, we have Numenor. And typically what we do with the podcast, what we've been doing is just going kind of by storyline, because I know sometimes it's tough just to go with oh, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. Sometimes it's easy just to think about the dwarves and what happened to them, and for the rest of the storylines as well. So we just so I just give a quick kind of breakdown with the dwarves. You've got the King of Moria. I guess he gets the seven rings in the beginning there. They don't show them giving it to him, which I thought was a little bit too bad. Kind of would have liked to see at least some transaction there. But so we saw him with the rings, kind of move into him using the ring to figure out where they should dig to get the light to come through the mountain. And Tius isn't too happy about that, because he's like, my singing should be what we're doing for this, not this crazy ring. And then from that moves into the younger Durin, basically kind of wondering if this ring is even for good. He goes back to Celebrimbor, I do believe, from what I remember. And then anything else on that one you remember that I'm missing?
So I think the only thing that's probably missing is Durin is starting to notice that his father's acting a little odd ever since he put that ring on. And the Delve Master of Khazad-dûm, Narvi, he's also him and Durin the younger are all right, what's going on here? Because this is kind of going a little insane.
Mm-hmm. So that is one point that we can touch on there about Narvi. So I believe he is a lore character, and
yes.
he did work with Celebrimbor, right, to build the Moria door, right, and that's what they showed in that episode, right? So,
Correct.
Is that would you say was that pretty lore accurate then, that whole thing, or?
Yeah. So Narvi isn't mentioned too much in Tolkien's lore, but It is said that he was the one who inscribed upon the doors, and Celebrimbor also helped design them. They were the ones who created the doors hand in hand together. That's kind of all we really know. We know that he was a really great dwarven craftsmith, but we don't really get to know too much else. So the Rings of Power kind of expands on that by making him what's called the Delve Master of Khazad-dûm, is the title I think I heard them give to him a few times.
Yeah, they don't really give him too much time necessarily, but you're saying like they're digging more into, like, by giving him the name Delve Master, that's kind of giving him more of a role to play in the story. Which is kind of cool. Kind of cool to see like different characters who you don't see come up a lot from the lore, given a little bit more time in the Rings of Power. But also we can talk about some more too of like maybe they don't give as much time as they should. It would be kind of more interesting if they would give more time to those things.
Yeah, I think Narvi's a great example of that. I mean, he's only mentioned, I think, like in like 2 sentences total throughout the entire bit of lore, but obviously he plays like a pretty big part. He's one of the best dwarven craftsmiths, and he's working with elves, which is like something that rarely happens.
Yeah.
And I think that just goes a lot to say about like how amazing of a writer Tolkien is that he can just have one single sentence that another storyteller can just expand on and create like a whole plot line out of, because Tolkien just has so much rich detail in what he writes.
Right. Yeah. So going on some to the ring and how that's affecting the King of Moria there. So it's interesting is in a previous episode we did mention about how that ring, I believe, that the king had was like always like kind of questioned about what the dwarves kind of said, oh, this may not actually be affected by Sauron. I don't know if you remember that at all. So I don't know if that's this exact situation with this king that they would be pulling from, but I guess that was interesting to think about that. And it was, I mean, of course, all the dwarf rings would be corrupted by Sauron. Like that's kind of what would be assumed, at least. But
yeah, so it's really interesting, and I think you guys talked about it in the episode of your podcast when you were talking about the first 3 episodes of season 2. You talked about this a bit, where, I mean, I kind of see why the show writers did it, but they changed the order of the making of the rings. And I can kind of understand why they were wanting to do that, but I think it did create like a lot of problems that they now have to kind of work around. But yeah, what's really interesting is that the 7, once they got into the dwarves' hands, depending upon, because Tolkien had 2 conflicting accounts about this. In one version, the 7 rings for the dwarves were given to Durin III by the elven smiths of Eregion, which is basically what happens in this episode. That actually is something that's mentioned in the appendices of Lord of the Rings. But it also says that even though the elven smiths gave that ring to Durin III, it doubtless had Sauron's evil power on it, since he aided in the forging of all the 7. And it's interesting that they are now showing the harmful effects of the ring already on the dwarves, because that wasn't really something that happened in the lore until after Sauron created the One Ring, after he kind of like revealed that he had been posing as Annatar. So they're kind of bringing that corruption forward a bit, and that's something that we're seeing already, which isn't like necessarily the worst thing in my opinion. I mean, it's making for very interesting television, but it's just like the order of the lore being switched up is a little interesting.
So that's something definitely that that we've mentioned in our podcast before too. So the changing of the order of the rings, and then what was the other thing that you mentioned too there? There was something else you were just talking about too. I was gonna ask a question.
Oh, you're good. So yeah, there's 2 different versions. There's the version where the elven smiths give Durin III the ring, but there actually is also another version in which it's never really made clear if the 7 rings were meant for elves or for dwarves originally.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
So that's something that like is brought up in the Unfinished Tales, where the elven smiths create the 7 and the 9 as sets, and it's kind of inferred that they're meant for elves. And then Sauron, once he like reveals his betrayal, he goes to Lord Celebrimbor in Eregion, and he basically like tortures him to find out where the 7 are, and the Nine, and he takes them, and then the Silmarillion continues the story by saying that Sauron then dealt the rings out to the other peoples of Middle-earth, hoping thus to bring under his sway all those that desired secret power beyond the measure of their kind. 7 rings he gave to the dwarves, but to the men he gave 9.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. So I guess, yeah, it's interesting that Sauron wouldn't have revealed himself until after he put the rings out there. But I can kind of see how that would be more to his advantage, because now you have Durin the Younger being like, "Oh, hey, like, what's up with this? I got to go back and like figure out like what the elves are doing," you know. So it makes sense for like Sauron wanting to just reveal himself at the time that he would want to reveal himself.
Yeah. I will say, like, even though I was a little surprised that they're introducing the corruption of the 7 so early, I was really impressed with how they're doing it, because how they're doing it is matching up really well, I think, with what Tolkien wrote about the effects that the 7 dwarf rings had on the dwarf lords. I've always loved the dwarves. I'm a huge dwarf nerd, and I've been waiting to see the 7 rings actually like get a time to shine in the story ever since they announced that this show was happening. So it's really cool, even though like the timeline is definitely a little wonky. It's really cool to see parts of the lore actually being expanded, especially in this episode.
Yeah. Well, it's just like one thing too is I hope they also, whenever like the rings go to other dwarves eventually, that they also give them some storyline. Because I think that in the show, like, they haven't really expanded on a whole lot. So it's like, even with just like them like creating the rings and giving them to the dwarves, I feel like, oh, okay, all of a sudden, like this episode, like at the beginning, they gave them to him. I know it's like not a huge thing, I guess, but it just a little bugged me in a way. But
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. Like, I feel like if they don't show how the other dwarf lords are affected by rings, I think it's going to be a bit of like wasted potential, because there's like some really, really good stuff there, especially that could like make great stories for later seasons. Because Tolkien mentions that there are 4 dwarven kingdoms in the lands of Rune, which obviously the show is exploring right now. There are 4 dwarven kingdoms out in the east, and a certain number of them we know that 4 dwarf rings in the future at some point are lost to dragons. And I feel like, I mean, come on, a chance to have a dragon in the Rings of Power TV show. I feel like if you're not going to take advantage of that, what are you doing?
no, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, definitely. So like just thinking about like this dwarven storyline, anything come up that you're thinking this wasn't really lore accurate?
Yeah, the one thing that besides the whole thing with like the timeline of how everything was happening, the one thing that I was a little tepid about was the idea of the Balrog being introduced so early. I mean, they've kind of shown shots of the Balrog in the trailer, and then of course in this episode Disa goes down to a cavern and she stumbles upon some sort of creature that is growling in the darkness, and it's implied that it's the Balrog. The Balrog isn't really due to appear until the Third Age in the year 1980, and actually he slays Durin VI, the king of Moria at that time, and that's when the kingdom falls into darkness. So I'm kind of wondering if, because I know we've seen glimpses of the Balrog in the trailer, I'm kind of wondering if they're going to introduce the Balrog this early, like as soon as they get the ring, suddenly Moria falls into darkness, or I don't really know how they're going to handle that. I thought that was interesting that they were bringing the Balrog in so early.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, because it definitely seems like the whole realm of Moria is going to continue on for like more longer than this. I don't know exactly when, you know, the Fellowship, you know, arrived in Moria, and like this time span between that and when it actually fell. Um, yeah, it just seemed like I don't know how long that was, but it seemed it was a lot longer that it went on than back then. So
Yeah, it's if I remember correctly, it's like from where the show is now, about 1,000+ years in the future, then it falls to the Balrog, and then 2,000 years after that is when the Fellowship enters, and then when Gandalf fights the Balrog. The Balrog is kind of just like chilling in an abandoned Khazad-dûm for about 2,000 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay. But like Gandalf knows that, and
Hmm.
Saruman
Yep.
knows that. No, that's cool. That's cool. All right, so let's move on to the elves now. So we got basically that the whole time you have Annatar, Halbrand, working with Celebrimbor to make the make rings. Celebrimbor's kind of hesitant to make more. Not really sure why he's hesitant, except that like he just maybe just felt like there wasn't something right about him about the 7 they made, and he was like, no, there's no more rings we're gonna do. Like we've done enough. Like we got 3, and we've also got the 7. But then Anatar's just trying to like influence him to make the 9 for men, and eventually Celebrimbor is convinced, and that's kind of the general way it starts going. You've got the girl too, who puts on a ring and like goes into the to the realm, the
The unseen world.
unseen world. Yes, right. Yes, unseen world. So yeah, any thoughts of that?
Yeah, I had a lot of thoughts that I was like really enjoying with this particular plot line. I think it's shaping up to be my favorite of the season so far. I think that while like the idea of the 7 already corrupting the dwarves isn't necessarily accurate, Sauron's manipulation of Celebrimbor in this episode specifically, I think is done really well, and it's done like in the vein of the lore. Because obviously Celebrimbor in like the lore, he never had reservations about making the 9 or the 7, unlike the show. But I do like how Annatar or Sauron, whichever you want to call him, is so masterful in making it all turn back on Celebrimbor and making it look like it's his fault. I thought that was just like kind of brutal, where he was just like, "Oh, you lied to your High King. How can you do this? You infected the process. Now we have to make the 9 to like kind of achieve balance." I think that ties in pretty well with like this one quote from Unfinished Tales that says, "Now Celebrimbor was not corrupted in heart or faith, but he had accepted Sauron as what he posed to be." We don't get too many clues as to like Celebrimbor's personality really through the lore, because it's from the Silmarillion, so it's more told like a myth than it is like a book, like a standard fantasy book as we would think of it nowadays. But like I feel like lines like that show that like Celebrimbor really does care. I mean, he's definitely prideful, but he cares a lot, and Sauron is just twisting the knife in at this point, which I thought just like made it really compelling.
Yeah, yeah. How do you feel about like just Celeborn's like portrayal in the show? I know they kind of give him another thing we've talked about too is just like how there are like different skills or like characteristics that can come together in Tolkien's world, and they don't have to be separate. Like Celebrimbor is a smith, but like in the lore, he's also like powerful in other ways, a good fighter. But they seem to give Celebrimbor maybe this sense of like being like weaker in that area.
Yeah, that's something that's really interesting, because you're right. He is at one point in the lore it says that whenever Sauron comes up to him and demands the 7 and the 9 and the 3, Celebrimbor faces him down with a sword at the entrance to the forge. I'd be interested to see if that actually happens in the show, because it doesn't seem to. Celebrimbor in the show so far doesn't seem to be any sort of like warrior. He seems to be more of just like like the nobility lord kind of deal, but who also is an extremely gifted blacksmith. We don't really see much of like the warrior kind of thing. So I'm interested to
Right.
see if they're gonna kind of do that. Maybe like I don't know, in the finale or something, like have Celebrimbor whip out a sword. I'd be interested to see
Ah,
what's gonna happen with that.
yeah, yeah. Because, but then it would be odd, like odd a little bit.
Yeah, it would be
All of a
like a little
sudden,
random.
yeah, to flip it and have him all of a sudden start using a sword.
Hmm.
But yeah, no, that would definitely make for a better kind of showdown there.
Yeah, it would be. It definitely has drama like just built in there already.
Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing that I wanted to touch on that you talked about was the girl smith, the one with the blonde hair. They name her Murdania in the show, and they have her testing a ring. And I was actually really happy that they included this, because in addition to the 3, the 7, and the 9, there was a large number of lesser rings that were made during this time. And Gandalf explains this to Frodo briefly in Fellowship of the Ring. He says, "In Eregion long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals." So I was actually really happy that we got to see some of the lesser rings, because again, with like the way they switched up the order of everything by making the three first, they didn't have the lesser rings beforehand. So I was like, oh man, I guess we're gonna kind of miss out on seeing that. But then they were able to like kind of sneak it into this episode, which I thought was pretty cool. Just also the little nod to like whenever Frodo enters the unseen world in the Peter Jackson film that has like all that mist, that kind of like grayed out kind of surroundings. They kind of allude to that in this show, which I thought was a pretty neat kind of nod to those films.
Right. Yeah. That was. I feel like that was an accurate portrayal of what was happening there. And honestly, actually thinking about that, there are other times when it has seemed like they're pushing a little too hard to like connect with the films. But like, yeah, that scene there, it definitely seemed that they were just, hey, this is just like the way things are with like the unseen world, and yeah, this is what happens. You put on the ring, yeah. But that was good, yeah.
But that also, like, interesting enough, that kind of goes into what I wanted to talk about a bit with like some of the lore inaccuracy of that plotline. There wasn't too much that was like inaccurate per se beyond what we talked about, but the smiths that Celebrimbor is with in the workshop that we see throughout the entire episode, in the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales, they're called the Gwaith y Myrdain, and they are a secret like society or brotherhood that Celebrimbor has formed that's very powerful in Eregion. And I think so. The girl smith, her name is Murdania, which I think is like the writers trying to allude or nod to the idea of the Gwaith y Myrdain, because I don't think they actually have the rights to say the words Gwaith y Myrdain in the show. There's like a whole bunch of like, you know, discrepancies with what they can and can't mention. So I think it was interesting just seeing how they were trying to like dance around it by having Murdani as a character. She's kind of like the distilled version of that brotherhood, so that you can kind of see she's like an audience surrogate. You can kind of like see the corruption of Celebrimbor and like the seduction of Sauron as Annatar. So like I get why they did it, but like her character and the society that she belongs to are definitely a bit different in the original writing.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know about the society, so that's a cool part to the story then. But I don't. But as you were saying, like, would they be able to have that in the show?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's so weird because I've heard a few industry insiders talk about this, and even they aren't exactly sure what they do and don't have rights to. There's rumors that they had to get rights to mention a few characters in this season that they didn't have before. They're like constantly being in like a dialogue with the Tolkien estate about what they can and can't mention, which I can just imagine would be like super frustrating if I was a writer. I would just be like, let me mention some characters from the Silmarillion, dang it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, I imagine it does impede like how they're telling the story,
Mhm.
and the more loops they have to jump through, which a lot of people probably don't know because they're not seeing like behind the scenes and
Yeah,
all.
exactly.
But yeah, so that's like that's neat about that lesser ring coming up. I thought that was interesting that it made her disappear, because I guess that's another thing, is that depending on like how powerful the being is, the ring may not turn you invisible. Is that kind of
Yeah, so that's a interesting thing I was actually just like reading up on today, because I had like a few questions about that too. From what I understand, it's rings are much more likely to make men invisible, not necessarily elves. I think that they were just trying to show that these rings can turn people invisible. I don't know if is necessarily lore accurate, because I mean, obviously, elves being able to see into the unseen world, that definitely is a thing. And also, whenever Frodo puts the One Ring on, Gandalf says he steps halfway into the Wraith world or the unseen world. So there's a precedent for that, but like having her be invisible, I think it's like a gray area, kind of. I'm not exactly sure about
Okay.
that.
Yeah. The elves just being more
Mm-hmm.
powerful in a lot of different ways than men.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting with Celebrimbor's line in there, and I had put it down there just about like we cannot give the rings to men,
Mm.
and him just like I guess trying to touch on how corruptible they can be, which is interesting because Sauron's probably thinking like, no, this is why I want to give rings to men.
Yeah. And I find it so funny that like when Sauron starts listing, he's like, there's always a few who rise up and shine in the darkness, and he mentions Baron, son of Barahir. I'm like,
Yeah,
has Sauron killed Barahir? So I'm just like, man, that's another level of just cold.
man. He also mentioned Tuor or
Yeah.
Turin. Is it Tuor or Turin that he mentioned?
Tuor.
It was Tuor. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. That was neat.
Yeah,
That
I
was
love
neat.
that. But yeah, like I also understand kind of where Celebrimbor is coming from this because I guess from Celebrimbor's perspective, he's hasn't really had too many dealings with men. And I guess the only dealings that he really would have had with men are there were some that fought on the Valar side when Morgoth was defeated, but like the majority of men were fighting with Morgoth in the First Age. So I guess there's a little bit of like reason for him to be just naturally suspicious of men at this point, not wanting to give them rings because he understands like the power behind what they're doing. But yeah, of course, Sauron's just like, wait, just give men another chance.
Yes, that's true. So, all right, so let's move on to our third storyline. So we got the men of Numenor,
Mm.
and so it's they come to an interesting point now, more where the faithful and the Kingsmen are now clashing, and there's beginning to be basically the Kingsmen are trying to like overthrow or put away the faithful so they don't have any more like commanding power. See that with Elendil. They're like, hey, if you're still be a part of the faithful, you gotta get rid of your rank, and you can like I don't just get rid of your rank. I guess is what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think they were like cleaning out like the Sea Guard. I think the Sea Guard was mostly loyal to the Queen, so they were kind of just like letting them all go in a sense.
Okay, yeah. So we got that. I think like yeah, again like you were saying, I thought this episode was really good. They had a lot of interesting parts were that really like caught my attention and kept me interested. And then we go all the way. I guess like kind of I can't kind of end it or like the high point was when the one like younger guy who would have been like Isildur's friend
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, he kind of came up against the Farazan's son,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a clash there. And this is like one thing I had problem with this, and I think maybe some other people picked up on it too. Like you have this guy who's a soldier, he's attacked by like Farazan's son, and like Farazan's son doesn't seem like he's got much to him, but
No.
like how he's able to like get the guy in the water, the guy's able to break free, and then like he dislocates his shoulder, and then the guy ends up killing him. But so that's just kind of how it all like just escalated to, I think, in that storyline.
Mm-hmm.
But anything there with like lore accuracies?
Yeah, so I was actually really happy to see this episode. I think that we are finally starting to enter like the parts of the lore that Numenor is based off of, especially like what the Rings of Power is trying to get to. Because I would argue up until this episode, we've only seen like mostly stuff invented by the show writers. Like they carry over a lot from like the ideas behind Numenor, but this is the first time that we're actually starting to see things like directly from the text. So in the Silmarillion, for example, cause was sought against the faithful that they hated King Pharazôn and were his rebels, or that they had plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges brought against them were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. Which I thought was like, yeah, I recognized that like as soon as like the tension started happening between the faithful and the Kingsmen. I kind of get the sense that the writers have been waiting to get to this point because this is like the initial spark that starts to build towards the downfall of Numenor. So I can tell that like there's a lot of like eagerness behind this story, which I thought that was pretty neat and pretty gratifying to finally see.
True. Yeah, it seems to me that they would almost have the faithful just kind of like try to escape Numenor at a certain point, and maybe they try to like retake it over. I don't know, but they're gonna get back to Middle Earth somehow,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, before it all goes down.
Yeah, so that's something pretty interesting that I think that they alluded to a little bit with Elendil's vision in the Palantir. I think that's what they're alluding to. Because in once things start to get really bad in Numenor in the future, some of the faithful go over into Middle Earth, and they like go to like Pelargir, where Theo and Arondir are now, and Isildur is now. And then some of them go to the west of Numenor, which is something that they were kind of bringing up intermittently in the first season. They kept talking about like the true Numenor, if you remember. Isildur was like wanting to go to the western shores of Numenor and find it. There was a city of like the faithful that kind of was established as like a safe haven for the faithful, and I think that's kind of what Elendil was riding towards in the vision that he saw in the Palantir. This is just me speculating, but I think that's what they're trying to build for in the future.
Okay, so you're saying there is a more like Western like habitation possibly, but then there's also Middle Earth to the east.
Yeah. So they all start
Okay.
to flee the central city of Anuminas. That's where most of the stuff in the show has been happening so far, the city of Anuminas. The faithful start to just try to get away from that city because a lot of horrible things start to go down inside that capital city. And then eventually it ends with a lot of the faithful getting to Middle Earth after the downfall of Numenor.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a little bit more of like projecting like what possibly could come, but like another thing too would be like neat to see like the Numenorians and like their full power and being like more powerful than like they're more powerful than just like other men on Middle Earth, right? So
Yeah.
like you've got like I want to see Elendil pull out his sword. I just want to like I don't know if they're hinting that the sword he has now is
Narsil.
Narsil or
Oh,
if it's like somewhere else.
yeah, so I think that they had it in the background of a scene in season 1.
Okay.
Whenever
Yeah.
Galadriel and Miriel go to the Palantir for the first time, you can see Narsil back on the wall behind them. And I think because I noticed that Elendil gave up his sword this episode when he was like surrendering his duty as a captain, and I was like, all right, let's hope that we're trading in a sword at
Yes.
this point. Let's go.
Yes. That's true. Yeah, so I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
That'd be great. All right, so any other things you've catch from the Numenorean storyline? Anything like less lore accurate?
Yeah, I think we'll have to talk about Kemen, Pharazon's son. So, Pharazon, we know very little about his family. It's never mentioned that he has a son, so this is definitely like a creation by the show writers. I think that my personal theory is that they're introducing Kemen right now to save Pharazon as the big bad for later on. Because Pharazon, he's gonna be something else in the next few seasons, and I think that they're trying to, give a little bit of breathing room to like have him save him as the big bad, kind of how they kept putting off Palpatine in the original Star Wars movies. I think that Kemen is being introduced as like a secondary antagonist just to try and like get under your skin, but kind of also just like show how terrible Pharazon is or how he's going to be, which I thought was pretty interesting. I mean, Kemen is just so punchable, especially in this
Yeah.
episode.
Yeah. What also gets on my nerves is Elendil's daughter, who also isn't lore.
Yeah.
So like I can see her just like staying with and being like with the destruction of Numenor, and
Yeah.
in the end, just like and not like coming over to Middle Earth. I can see that happening because like
So
there's not really much. What else are they gonna do with her? You know?
yeah, so there is a theory that's been going around that I am totally 100% bought into. We know at some point in the future, Sauron comes to Numenor and he convinces the Numenorians to build a temple to Morgoth. And for a temple, you need an architect, and Eärien just joined the Architects Guild, and she's now aligning herself with the evil guys on Numenor, so I think she's gonna probably be involved in some pretty terrible things in the future.
Yeah. Now, our Pharazôn, isn't his son also an architect? Or is that were they casting him differently?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what he is. I don't know if he's trying to be an architect or if he's trying to be a politician at this point. I think I don't even know if he knows. He just seems really desperate to please Daddy at this point.
Yes. Oh my. Yeah, that's true. That's so true.
And speaking of family members, the one big like lore thing that I keep returning to is where is Isildur's brother? Because he's mentioned twice in the first season, and I was like, okay, they're saying that he's off in the west part of Numenor. I get it. You don't want to like have too many characters at once to overwhelm the audience. I thought for sure they were going to bring him in this season because with Isildur stuck in Middle Earth and Elendil grieving and Eärien, siding with the king, this would be the perfect time for Anarion, Isildur's older brother, to be there. Someone for Elendil to like hold on to. So I don't really know why they haven't brought him into the story at this point, because I feel like if they wait any longer, it's going to be really contrived when they try to bring him in the future. Like, oh, hey, dude, where have you been for the past 2 seasons? Your brother could have used you. Yeah, because Anarion is the one who eventually is the ruler of Minas Tirith, or Minas Arnor as it's first called. And Isildur is running the other city in the Kingdom of Gondor. So they're like basically like the twin kings at that point in Gondor. So having Anarion in the story, I think, is kind of pivotal. So I'm just surprised that they haven't brought him in yet. And I felt like his absence was a little sorely missed, at least by me, in this episode.
Well, hopefully they're gonna bring up a big climax in that one, so that kind of his appearance would kind of make a big impact.
Yeah, hopefully.
So looking at these the different ways that Amazon's writing these stories, and sometimes we can see differences in the lore, similarities in the lore too, but I think like mostly in some differences, you might be able to tell how Amazon's trying to write a story that's maybe gonna fit more of a modern setting, as opposed to like the way Tolkien be writing his story to be more of a lasting impact on people that, in a sense, is enduring, right? No matter where you're at, you're still gonna find some value in the stories in his writing.
Yeah.
Endless, kind of endless. Yeah. So can you see like anything with these different storylines that kind of like hits you?
Yeah. So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot with this show in particular is this show is in a really weird place where it has very little to go off of and also a lot to go off of at the same time. And another thing that the entire premise of the show is based off the Rings of Power, which is something that Tolkien kind of left ambiguous in his writing. Like, we don't really get to know a lot about the purposes of the rings. Like, we do get like some insight here and there, and in some of his letters and in like chapters of the Silmarillion, we get some insight. But overall, Tolkien had a lot of ambiguity in his writing, while also like just having this enormous scope. I think the show is building into people's desires nowadays to like know about lesser known parts of the work, like, getting to explore the lands of Rune and things like that. But it's also kind of falling into the trap of this modern literary narrative of, if a show doesn't explain everything, it's bad writing. So I feel like the show is kind of like trying to justify itself by explaining a lot, and maybe some stuff that could have been left ambiguous. So there's like very little room for ambiguity, I feel like, in the modern audience. And I think that the show is kind of struggling with that because it's like, well, how much do we explain here? How much do we leave it kind of vague and open to interpretation here? Yeah, it's very interesting just like thinking about that. I've just been thinking about that a lot, especially this season.
Right. Yeah. I think that something, and that kind of goes off of that, and we've talked about in other episodes, is how, like Amazon's The Rings of Power has tried to give like a backstory in a sense to a lot of things that have happened in the Lord of the Rings, trilogy, and maybe like that all of that doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
need to be fleshed out so much all the time, kind of a
Yeah.
thing. But
No, that's a really good point. Is that like that's also the thing I think it's a big struggle with prequels in general. I think prequels kind of feel a need to connect a lot to the original story. And it can be done well, but it also can you can go overboard with it fairly quickly. I feel like that's also just I personally don't mind like the Harfoot storyline, for example. It's not my favorite by any stretch. I don't mind it, but I can understand people's frustrations with it because it seems to be primarily there to connect viewers to the Hobbit storylines that they love so much in Lord of the Rings. So I feel like there's definitely a struggle with trying to write a prequel show like this.
yeah, definitely. So if you could pull out like a least favorite and a most favorite part of this episode, where would you which would it be?
Yeah, so I'll start with my least favorite part. I really enjoyed this episode. It might be one of the best in the show, in my opinion, but I'll admit I was really disappointed with the Doors of Durin. I was hoping for a much grander reveal. I was kind of hoping to like see them set the doors in the side of the mountain and like see like the moonlight, shining on the runes and everything. And instead, what we kind of got was like draw down the curtain. Here's the doors. Huzzah! And they like raise their glasses. So I was just kind of I don't know if I like set myself up too much for wanting more from that scene, but I thought that it was like something really cool that directly goes into like Lord of the Rings that's actually like there in the lore, and then they kind of just had it like very underwhelming.
Yeah. No, I think it happens a lot, especially in this season. It's happened a lot with just there are these lore things that like they could be stretching out more, or like just kind of giving more time to make things more interesting and whatnot. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and like kind of building off of that, like I've said before, I'm like very passionate about the dwarves and the dwarven rings of power. And I remember because I love my favorite scene of the first season is when they're forging the elven rings in like the last 5 minutes of the episode. Like it's like beautiful cinematography. It's really cool to see them at work and everything. And I remember thinking, oh, I hope we get to see something like that with the dwarven rings being made. And we didn't. And I was like, darn it.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, definitely. I agree. So like, what about your most
Ooh,
favorite?
my favorite part. I loved the attack on the faithful scene. I wasn't expecting to care so much about Valandil's death. I just think that scene just happened to be like just acted out pretty well. And like the guy who plays Elendil, Lloyd Owen, I believe his name is, he just like gave his all to that scene. And so I just really enjoyed that. Also, I knew that Valandil was going to die because in the future, Isildur names his son Valandil, and Valandil becomes one of the first kings of Gondor. So once they had this character named Valandil in the show, I was like, oh great, something terrible is going to happen to this guy. That Isildur is going to name his son after him. So I really love that part. But another scene that I really loved too was Celebrimbor at the very end discussing with his smiths about how they're going to make the nine. And he's like, if you're not giving 100% in this project, you're no longer a smith of Eregion. And he like goes upstairs and his hands are like shaking. He's all agitated. And then Sauron just like slides in with a smile. And he's like, my friends, I know that Celebrimbor seems intemperate, but I'm here to help you. Let's get to work, shall we? I was just like, oh man, that is just cruel.
Yeah, a lot of well done stuff there. Definitely my favorite episode by far too. Yeah, I think Yeah, I think the Clash of the Faithful and the Kingsmen was definitely cool. I just wanna see, like, I feel like the action from the first season wasn't so great. So to see some more action here, I think, like, I did in general for this season, they definitely got the Numenorean storyline going
Hmm.
really well. Like, there hasn't been a part with them that I haven't
Yeah.
liked, honestly, really, overall. So I really like that. I think the guy who died was definitely, like, a bummer. I did like his
Hmm.
character, I think. He grew on me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see because the next 3 weeks are like the 3 week basically part finale where it's all the Battle of Eregion. So I'm interested to see because we kind of got like the Battle of the Southlands. It was more like a skirmish of the Southlands in the first season. So I'm really excited and interested to see how the Rings of Power is going to do a full on battle scene, something like Helm's Deep kind of deal. I'm interested to see how that's going to go in terms of just like action and pacing, how well they handle that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Definitely, it'd be cool. I think for me, it would almost be this sense of it being so epic, and then, you get to it, and it's not, and it's like, "Alright, gotta rein things in here. Be careful about, not being maybe not being too excited."
Yeah.
Right.
I don't want to get my hopes up too high.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, that was great. Well, thanks, Jared, for coming on and reviewing things on the 5th episode
Yeah,
here.
thanks so much for having me.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah. This was great, yeah. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time for our review of Episode 6 of The Rings of Power Season 2. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag @The White City Podcast.